We've spent the past 3 weeks talking about introductory matters to the Old Testament book of Hosea. Important things to discuss before we look at the text, but today we're going to get into chapter 1 as we begin a verse by verse look at what this Old Testament prophet had to say. We will be spending most of our time talking about family matters associated with Hosea because his family was used kind of as a visual aid, if you will, to what the bigger message God was trying to share about the nation of Israel. Relatively little is known specifically about Hosea and his family. We have some facts mentioned here, but not as much as time has been devoted to it. Scholars have unfortunately devoted more attention to the questions of biography raised by chapters 1 and 3 than to the rest of the book. And the results have been predictably disappointing. Sometimes we lose sight of the forest for the trees. And again, scholars start debating and arguing over Hosea's family and kind of ignore the rest, unfortunately. So we're going to endeavor not to do that. But we do need to spend some time talking about that. And it comes up right away in the first few verses of chapter 1. Hosea chapter 1, verse 1 says, "The word of the Lord which came to Hosea, the son of Beeri, during the days of Uzzah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and during the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel." Now I would point you specifically to just the first few verses, or words rather, of verse 1. And it's a good reminder to all of us. It speaks there of the word of the Lord. The most significant thing to note as we begin to look at the text of Hosea is that this is a word of the Lord. Yes, God is speaking through Hosea as he did through the prophets, but yet it's not, again, words that Hosea is making up as he goes along or later editors putting in to tell their story. No, this is, according to the text, a word of the Lord. The book as a whole contains God's word and message. The narrative portions, the prophet's words, the divine oracles, the homiletical conclusions, again, that we're going to talk about originate with God. So we need to understand that very clearly. And I think that's perhaps why it's stated right at the beginning. But this is a word of the Lord, as verse 1 says, which came to Hosea, the son of Beeri. The name Hosea means to rescue or to deliver, with God being the unexpressed subject. The full thought upon which the name is based is the Lord has rescued or delivered us. The name, or a form of it, is found 16 other times in the Old Testament. In fact, in places like Numbers chapter 13 and verse 16 and Deuteronomy 32 verse 44, we'll find reference there to a familiar name, and that's Joshua, the one who served under Moses. And Joshua is a name related to Hosea. Joshua, of course, has the one who is rescuing or delivered mentioned. That's where you get the J. Anyway, it's Joshua, or Josh. It's related to Hosea. Again, you can get a concordance and look up the other times. But ultimately, of course, the Hebrew name for Jesus is Joshua as well. The Lord rescues us. And of course, through Christ, he was the ultimate rescuer. Hosea's father, named Beeri, his name likely means my wellspring. There's some debate about that. Again, while Hosea isn't specifically called a prophet in these opening words, as is true for some of the later prophets, in fact, Habakkuk 1:1, Haggai 1:1, and Zechariah 1:1 speaks of each of those prophets and refers to them as Haggai the prophet, or Habakkuk the prophet, or Zechariah the prophet. But it's clear here, even though Hosea isn't called a prophet out of the gate, that that's exactly what's going on in this book. Of course, we have the time reference. We talked about some in the introductory material here in verse 1. This word of the Lord came to Hosea during the days of Uzzah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah. Those are all kings of Judah in the south, and during the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel. The Judean kings, who are listed first here in the verse, reigned between 791 BC. That's the beginning of Uzziah's reign, and 686 BC, the end of Hezekiah's reign. And of course, Jeroboam's the only one mentioned. He was that long-lasting king in the northern kingdom of Israel. Some reigned from 793 to 753 BC, some 40 years. And as we mentioned, as we talked about that, after his death, and Jeroboam II's reign was a time of prosperity that ultimately led to a lot of sin in Israel. But after his death, they went through a succession of 5 or 6 other kings that didn't last long at all. The nation slid into a little bit of chaos as that went on. Since many of Hosea's prophecies can be dated confidently after 753, during a time of no less than 6 other northern kings, it would seem here that the mention of a single northern king is in fact a token, if you will. God gave his word, of course, the point here in verse 1, he gave his word, his prophetic word to Hosea in a specific time and place. It's a revelation delivered in history and is substantially historical in its content. It was, however, although mentioned in a certain time or a certain area of time in a certain place, it's not limited solely to that one time and place. Just as later Judeans, to whom Hosea did not actually preach, revered and preserved his preaching, we recognize in it God's timeless message about the sanctity of his covenant, hardly limited to the days of certain ancient kings. So that's our lesson, if you will, today. Yes, this was written and prophesied in a time long ago to a specific people in a specific place, but it has some thing for us to learn today, and that's that God takes the terms of a covenant very seriously, and judgment comes on those who ignore it. That's the idea that we learn from these things that were written before. It's in some measure, the book of Hosea is our spiritual heritage as well as the spiritual Israel of God. Places like Romans chapter 15 and verse 4 and 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verse 11, those 2 verses in the New Testament tell believers that we're to learn from those things that happened a long time ago. So those Old Testament stories aren't included in the Bible as filler. No, we're to learn from them what we can. And we're going to do that, Lord willing, as we work through Hosea. All right, let's look at verse 2. Hosea chapter 1, verse 2. It says, when the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, go take to yourself a wife of harlotry and have children of harlotry, for the land commits flagrant harlotry, forsaking the Lord. So this marriage to a woman we're going to see in a moment who's named Gomer, and the naming of Hosea's children were the first public prophetic acts that God asked of Hosea. That's the thrust, I believe, there, the first phrase there in verse 2, and it says, when the Lord first spoke to Hosea. God didn't reveal it all at one time. He began at a certain point in Hosea's life, and at various times he inspired Hosea to say other things. But this is what happened at the very beginning. The identity and or profession of the wife or wives of chapters 1 and 3 has commanded much attention in the study of Hosea. Again, it's those 2 chapters, chapter 1 that we're in right now and chapter 3 that have something to say about Hosea's physical family and the people he was involved with at that time. Again, a lot of focus has been spent, a lot of ink has been spilled over what's going on here, and perhaps there's some questions can be raised that's not quite as plain as maybe you've heard it. Anyway, we'll talk some about that. There are legitimate questions about what's going on in Hosea's family. Things like, are the 2 women spoken of in chapters 1 and 3 the same woman? And you might say, well, that's obvious. Well, I don't believe it's necessarily quite obvious when you just take the text at face value. There are some good questions to be raised that perhaps 2 different women are referred to. It doesn't necessarily affect the overall message of Hosea, though. Was Gomer a prostitute or harlot when Hosea married her? Did she become unfaithful later and cause him in retrospect to think of himself as having set out to marry a prostitute? Another question, were any of the children illegitimate? Again, that's just assumed by many, but again, a careful reading might raise some questions there. And did Hosea divorce Gomer via a court proceeding, which is then given an allegorical cast in chapter 2. So those are a lot of legitimate questions that are raised. And as we run up against them in the text, we'll talk about them some. And again, and not necessarily we'll come up with a definitive answer one way or the other, but we'll look at the options. Okay, here in verse 2, we have God first speaking to Hosea, and what God tells him to do is to go take for yourself a wife of harlotry and have children of harlotry. Again, one of the questions we raised just a moment ago, was Gomer a prostitute when Hosea married her? Well, if you read the text carefully, the text doesn't specifically say that. The phrase, literally, it's there, a wife of harlotry. I know there are some versions that say, go take for yourself a prostitute. Well, that's taken some liberty with the Hebrew words there, because we don't have the single word for prostitute. It is literally a wife of prostitution or a wife of harlotry. That phrase in the Hebrew may refer to someone with an inclination toward that practice, not necessarily to someone in the midst of practicing it at the very time. There is another related Hebrew word for that. You run across it often in the Old Testament. There is a Hebrew word for harlot or prostitute, and it's related to this phrase when it says wife of harlotry. But that word, specific word for harlot or prostitute, isn't in the text. If that was the intention, God could have easily used that word. So that's one question raised here. This idea about when the text says a wife of harlotry might refer to a tendency towards something or an inclination toward it is revealed, I think, later in Hosea. In fact, in Hosea chapter 4 and verse 12, we find a similar phrase, not a wife, but a spirit here. It says, God says, my people consult their wooden idol, and their diviner's wand informs them, for a spirit of harlotry has led them astray, and they have played the harlot, departing from their God. So you catch the difference there, don't you? Yes, by the time Hosea is prophesying, Israel had fallen into spiritual harlotry, but yet they were led that way by what's referred to in the text as a spirit of harlotry, or this tendency that led them astray. So it started with inclinations towards something into the practice of it. And as Hosea 4:12 goes on, the spirit of harlotry led them astray, and they have played the harlot. So there came a point when they became what they were leaning towards, departing from their God. We see it later in Hosea chapter 5 and verse 4. It says, their deeds will not allow them to return to their God, for a spirit of harlotry is within them, and they do not know the Lord. So once again, it's this understanding of the phrase wife of harlotry. It's not as necessarily nailed down as some would make it. It's possible that Gomer might not have been a practicing harlot at the time, but just like most of Israel, she may have had some leanings that way. Again, we note the phrase the children of harlotry in this same verse. Remember what it says back there in verse 2? God tells Hosea, go take for yourself a wife of harlotry and have children of harlotry. Well, are we going to claim that the children were born as harlots? No. But being raised in that culture, they could easily give into those tendencies as well. And again, the real point here is the last part of verse 2 when it says, for the land commits flagrant harlotry, forsaking the Lord. And there you have specifically the main point here. And we don't want to lose sight of that in this study. You know, all these questions trying to answer about Gomer and Hosea and their physical family. Just remember that God is making a point here about Israel through Hosea's family, not making a definitive revelation about the family or maybe telling us everything we would like to know about it. You see, God, remember, he married Israel and Judah, and they became harlots, didn't they? And if we're going to follow the analogy God is making, no, God didn't take Israel and Judah as harlots. You know, they were joined with God in a covenant, marriage, if you will, and became harlots. So those are some things that tend to make me lean toward the fact that perhaps Gomer wasn't practicing harlot at the time. But again, points are made on both sides of that issue, and it really doesn't change the ultimate answer we're going to get to as far as the purpose of the book. All right, let's look at verse 3. Hosea chapter 1, verse 3. It says, So he went, speaking of Hosea, and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. Now, the prepositional phrase to him or to him is not present in the parallel statements of the birth of the other two children. Notice here it says, So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him, or Hosea, a son. All right. And I say, well, that's pretty straightforward, and it is. Obviously, Gomer and Hosea had marital relations, and a child was conceived, and a son was born or bore to Hosea. But some Bible students make a big deal of the fact that as you go on through chapter 1, for the next two children, it just doesn't say that the next two children were, this idea of bore him a son, just says she bore a daughter or bore a son. And they claim, based upon that fact, that perhaps the first child was born legitimately, but then based on the fact that him isn't in the text in the next verses 6 and 9, or 6 and 8 rather, that she became pregnant in practicing her harlotry. It was not born or bore to Hosea. But scholars tell us it's not possible to press the Hebrew grammar to the point of concluding that Jezreel was legitimate or born to him while the other two children were not. Hebrew has no fixed syntactical patterns for discriminating between legitimate and illegitimate children in that sense of the term. The general movement toward brevity of expression in chapter 1 as successive children are born is not as big a deal as some make of it. So I don't think we can use that at least to make this claim that these later children weren't Hosea's. Perhaps a bigger thing to mention here in verse 3 is just the plain idea that what did Hosea do when God told him to do something? It says, so he went and did it, right? To his credit, Hosea does what the Lord tells him to do. There's no hint of reluctance or excuses like we see in other servants of God. Perhaps this gives some weight to the idea that Gomer, again, wasn't currently practicing prostitution when they were married. It would be easy to see some reluctance on Hosea's part if God told him to go marry a prostitute. And I'm not saying God wouldn't ask him to do that. God asked the prophets sometimes to do some incredibly, difficult things. But it would seem like, at least given what we know about Hosea, is the idea that he might have put up a bigger fight than he did. But again, perhaps that's reading more into the text. Verse 4, it says, and the Lord said to him, speaking of Hosea, name him Jezreel for yet a little while, and I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. So now we're getting to the real issue here with the personal illustration of Hosea's family. This first child born in the family was linked by his name with the prophetic message from God in the book of Hosea. The command is exactly the same as it would be in the case of the next two children. God's going to have a name for them as well that means something prophetically. The names are what are called message names. We see it in other prophetic books, and some children born to the prophet Isaiah in chapter 7, verse 3, and chapter 8, verses 3 and 4. God tells Isaiah to name them certain things, and it had prophetic significance. We see it in Isaiah's prophecy of the Messiah in Isaiah 7, verse 14, and Isaiah 9, verse 5. And of course, there's numerous other instances in the Old Testament, just like Aholah and Aholabah in Ezekiel 23. But this particular message name for this first child born to Hosea and Gomer, Jezreel, is on the surface kind of ambiguous. It can mean various things, or its connotations are not immediately clear. It must have been therefore effective in conveying Yahweh's or God's message in those days when Jezreel was growing up. Can you imagine? Again, His name serving as this constant reminder of God's message to Hosea, since there were likely routine questions from friends and acquaintances about the meaning of this child's relatively ambiguous name. Why did you name him this anyway? They would have known a place named Jezreel in the city, but why in the world, Hosea and Gomer, did you name this child this way? Well, my guess is that gave Hosea a great opportunity to speak the message of judgment that the name implied. There were at least two possible references for Jezreel. There was a valley or a plain stretching between the Samarian highlands and the Galilee highlands named Jezreel. And there's also a town near Mount Gilboa at the eastern edge of the highlands near the Jalud Valley, which leads ultimately to Jordan. That town was named Jezreel. The town had been a second royal residence, according to scripture, in addition to Samaria in the north for the Omri dynasty kings. That's 1 Kings 18, chapter 21, and 2 Kings 8, verse 9 for some places to look that up. I believe it was the town, though, that provided the relevant historical focus here in this naming of this particular child, because as the text tells us here in verse 4, name him Jezreel for yet a little while, and I will punish the house of Jehu for the bloodshed of Jezreel. So there's the specific reference. It harkens back to Jehu, the northern kingdom's king that led to a bloody massacre in 2 Kings chapter 9 and verse 10. God told Jehu to go in and take out the Omrite dynasty. So he was doing what God told him to do, but yet as time went on, Jehu's dynasty fell into the same type of sin. So now, as part of God's judgment on Israel, God is going to eliminate this dynasty of Jehu. There will be another Jezreel, if you will, or another massacre. This one will apply the bloodshed of Jezreel to the family of Jehu. Such a punishment announcement, with its continuation in verse 5, reflects the covenant curses of war, the captivity of the king, and the death and destruction. These ties back to those covenantal curses we just studied in the introductory lessons in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 4 and Deuteronomy 28 through 32. That's part of what's going on. The phrase here in this verse, when it says it will not be long, catch that there in verse 4. Name him Jezreel for yet a little while, and I will punish the house of Jehu. That sets an approximate time frame for the execution of this judgment sentence of God. The judgment sentence is here pronounced, but its execution will take place according to God's timing. But I would use this phrase just to remind us all that God is serious about timing of events, especially prophetic timing. When God says it's going to happen in a little while, that doesn't mean 100 or 1,000 years in the future. And we knew it historically. This judgment promised by God to happen in a little while happened in time speaking a little while. The Jehu dynasty collapsed with the death of Zechariah in 752 BC. The literal fulfillment then spoken of here was indeed swift. Less than 40 years would be needed for the northern kingdom itself to come to an end. So this was prophesied sometime in 760. By the time we reach 722, that this judgment will be poured out. Verse 5, finally, this will be the last verse we'll take a look at in this lesson. God says, on that day I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. And again, you had the city of Jezreel and then the valley kind of associated with it. The Jezreel Valley was the site of the northern kingdom's loss of independence at the hands of the Assyrians. In 733 BC, the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser and his armies captured the valley in the Assyrian campaign to quell the rebellion in the northern part of Israel. The broad valley, this Jezreel Valley, was by Hosea's day already famous as a great historic battlefield, the scene of several decisive battles in Israel's past. Here's some examples. In Judges chapter 4 and 5, you've got Deborah and Barak's defeat of the Canaanites. That was associated with the Jezreel Valley. You've got Gideon's defeat of the Midianites in Judges chapter 6 and chapter 6 through 8. You've got the Philistine defeat of Israel under King Saul in 1 Samuel chapter 20, chapters 29 through 31. And then you've got the Egyptian defeat of Judah under Josiah in 2 Kings 23, verses 29 and 30. Valley of Jezreel is mentioned. So this is kind of an ongoing event in a long history of events for this region. The idea of when it says here, God says, I will break the bow of Israel, that's a Hebrew metaphor for military strength. You see it in places like Genesis 49, verse 24, 1 Samuel 2, verse 4, on and on. There's several listings. Again, you can get a concordance and check these out. But when God says, the bow was a military weapon, and for God, if you will, to break the bow is just a sign that God is going to break the strength of the northern kingdom. To break the bow is typical treaty curse language, symbolic of total defeat. Again, check out 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 4 in association with that. All right, that gives you an idea there on the first 5 verses here. Lord willing, next class period, we'll pick up in Hosea chapter 1 and verse 6. We got more children born to Hosea and Gomer, and their names are also going to be significant for what God has in store by way of punishment for his people. And I hope you'll tune in and study along with us when we get to that point. God bless and guide you in your studies of the scriptures.